Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special joint event hosted by the Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series and the Islands Matters Series. My name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm the chair of the INS Public Seminar Series, and I'll be co-hosting today's events with my colleague, Professor Andrew Jennings, who chairs the Islands Matters Series. Do you want to say hi, Andrew?
Yes, hi, Andrew, and hi, everyone else. This is a first time that we've combined the two seminars, but the Islands Matter seminars have been combined with others in the past, and it's always been a great success. For those who are unaware of Islands Matter series, we try and feature the best and brightest and most interesting research that's being undertaken in and about the Scottish Islands. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Juliette has to say today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We're going to be co-hosting more like Laurel and Hardy rather than Ant and Dec, I think, but we'll get through. So for those of you joining us for the first time today, a particularly warm welcome. As you will probably already be aware, today's session is being recorded and will be made available on the INS YouTube channel, where you can find a huge back catalogue of previous papers from both seminar series, which you can enjoy at your leisure. So if you don't want to appear on that recording, please just make sure that your camera and microphone are switched off for the duration. Now, speaking of which, you'll notice that your camera and microphone are currently disabled, and that's just to avoid any distractions during the presentation. But following the paper, I'll enable them during the question and answer session, just so that you can put your question directly to our speaker today by raising your virtual hand, or of course, you can use the chat function, and Andrew Jennings, who's chairing the Q&A, will read that out for everyone. Now, today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Juliette Desportes, who will be presenting on behalf of ourselves and Dr. Iain Robertson, who couldn't be with us today. Juliette and Iain are both members of staff at the UHI Centre for History, where they're currently working on the Leverhulme Trust funded project, Resistance to Improvement in the Highlands and Islands, 1750 to 1820, with Professor Carl Griffin of the University of Sussex. The project investigates how rural workers in the Highlands sought to defend their livelihoods and ways of life in the age of radical so-called improvements, which transformed the social and economic basis of Scottish agriculture. The project team has explored the relationship between those who worked the land and those who owned and managed it, by investigating the methods, timings, and geographies of protest, asking not only why people resisted changes to their environment and way of life, but where and how they did so. A year in, Juliette will be sharing with us some of the project's progress and findings thus far in her paper entitled Resistance to Improvement in the Highlands and Islands, 1750 to 1820. So a very warm welcome to you, Juliette, and thank you for coming to speak to us today.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me. Yeah, sorry, I didn't go original on the paper title there. So I'll share my screen. Excellent. Let me know. Hope you can see it okay. Full screen, all good. Yeah, excellent. Right, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much to INS for having me today, and special thank you to both Andrews for organizing the event. So as Andrew said in this talk, I'll be sharing some early insights from this ongoing project taking place at the Centre for History, which I am working on alongside two colleagues, Iain Robertson, who couldn't be here today, and Carl Griffin. And this talk, as the rest of the project, is very much the outcome of our collaboration. This quote from the great Scottish historian T.C. Smout offers a fitting starting point. Writing these lines in the 1960s in his classic History of the Scottish People, Smout sought to explain what he perceived as a national anomaly. Like others before and after him, like Karl Marx, Eric Osborne, Smout views Scotland, not just the Highlands and Islands, as a typical example of the development of a voracious type of agrarian capitalism. But at the same time, he observed that the Scottish peasant reacted little, if at all, to this agricultural revolution that swept the country both very rapidly and brutally in the course of about 50 years. Indeed, Smout wondered how to explain the passivity of Scottish tenants, who, seeing their world very rapidly privatized through the enclosure movement, commercialized with the creation of farms increasingly managed by capitalist farmers, neither protested in the courts like the English, or resorted to violence like the Irish white boys at the very same period. For Smout, and you can see in the quote, the answer lay in Presbyterian customs, in this rural Calvinism, which acted almost as an anti-radical force in a Scotland that was as constrained as it was docile. Oh, sorry, I've lost you. My screen went black. Hopefully you can still hear me and see me.
We can still see you and hear you, Juliette. You're still on that slide?
Okay, excellent. Yeah, no, sorry, my computer went completely black. Tech issues, but we're back on. Right. So yeah, I'm still on that slide. So more than 50 years later, Smout's analysis continues to dominate the historiography of this period of improvement, a concept ubiquitous amongst the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, as they sought to put the pursuit of progress into practice. The prevailing passivity of Scottish estate tenants continues to be accepted not only by historians, but also continues to shape research into what has been termed the first phase of clearance, a period which starts after the defeat of the Jacobite troops after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and ends with the more intensive start of clearance and immigration, beginning after 1810 and the radicalism of the 1820s. This was a period during which land and agricultural practices underwent profound changes to generate greater profit, with a new improved, and I'm using improved and improvements under quotation marks every time, improved agriculture, contrasting with primarily subsistence-based form of farming. And for the small tenants who occupied traditional townships in the Highlands and Islands, this was also a time, of course, associated with clearances, the expropriation of land and forced displacement to the coast to make way for sheep in the glens more typical of the Northwest. Strangely then, the role and reactions of these Highland tenants to agricultural improvement has been simply very little or not at all studied before 1800, giving free rein to what Christopher Whatley has termed the orthodoxy of passivity, the paradigm that forms the basis of the history of the clearances, during which the Highlanders were first defeated at Culloden, then exploited by unrestrained commercialism, and then finally dispossessed after 1790. Where protest has been found, a chronological and methodological bias has led historians to focus almost exclusively on dramatic, large-scale events driven by issues of possession of and access to land, such as the extraordinary Year of the Sheep in 1792 or the land raids of the 1880s and 1920s. This has then been allied to a particular focus on the crofting counties of the Northwest, with protests elsewhere and at different times relegated very often to a mere footnote. Labels and paradigms such as the so-called Crofters' Wars, that's the 1880s, and Highland resistance have become crutches to explain such actions, often hinting at rather than evidencing the existence of wider social movements to explain such actions driving protests. In this way, Highland protest has become a category of analysis in its own right, with its own geography, chronology, and even typology. From this, we have drawn together a set of dissatisfaction. As my colleague Iain Robertson puts it, we have established a concern with, first, views which sees only one-off spectacular outbreaks of protest and resistance in a sea of passive acceptance of change. Second, the adoption of overarching explanation and all-embracing superficial and exclusionary categorization. And lastly, a lack of engagement in the Highland historiography with recent historiographical developments in the study of path protest more broadly. So across our first year in this project, we've been thinking about meta-narratives and of the identification of a specifically Highland resistance. And I say Highlands, but I incorporate here the islands too. As you might imagine, current thinking in protest studies has moved well away from such overarching explanatory models. but the study of highlands and islands resistance and disturbances has not shifted with it. To Eric Richards or to Jim Hunter, perhaps the biggest names in the historiography of this period, everywhere you look, you find the drive to bind disparate events and often conflictual actors into a single unified whole. Many years ago, for instance, Eric Richards, the pioneer of Highland protest studies, suggested modeling the course events of resistance to improvement in a four-stage model. But this was in the 1970s, when this type of approach was the dominant one in the historiography, so we probably ought to forgive him for that. Equally, it is no surprise that Ken Logue, in his landmark book, Popular Disturbances in Scotland, or Jim Hunter, of course, adopted a class conflict model when thinking about these events. Less forgivable, perhaps, is the continued emphasis on such overarching models, with even the most recent work applying an ethno-linguistic framing to the land insurgency, singular and of the definitive article. When coupled with an exclusive focus on the on the dramatic and large-scale events, this enabled, we suggest, the emergence of a misleading category in label, Highland resistance. As we will demonstrate shortly, we are uncovering a much wider range of protests than this allows. Crucially, moreover, these additional protest types look remarkably similar to the forms of protests took outside of the Highlands in Scotland and indeed the British Isles. Highlands and Island protest actors acted in ways that parallel the actions of those facing rural, socioeconomic, and cultural transformations in different times and different places. All of this, we argue, has helped perpetuate the essentializing of a region and the trope of a distinct Scottish Highlands and Islands. And in this project, we are aiming to demolish it's not that we're aiming to demolish the metaphorical place of the Highlands in Scotland, but rather to think about the association a little bit more critically. We are undertaking that thinking in the context of engaging with the notion that the people of the Highlands and Islands were passive in face of dislocation rendered by improvement. Our project, in other words, is taking another swipe at the unconvincing notion of Highland victimhood. In this search for greater nuance, one key but largely unexpected point to emerge has been a concern with nomenclature. We have become aware that not only Highland historiography, but also protest studies more generally, has not fully worked out consensus over what delineates protest from resistance. When is an event resistance rather than protest, and vice versa? As this year has gone on, and we have started to write our first outputs, we have become more aware than ever that language and labels matter. Ian Fraser-Grigor, for example, was fairly unequivocal. Responses to the long-running processes of improvement were resistance. Protest for him is something more generalized and politically orientated. According to Fraser-Grigor, resistance is visible across the long durée of responses to improvement, while protest only appears with a more proactive event of the 1870s. There is more than a question of semantics and chronology, however. To think about the labels we attach to events and actions means we must also think about the nature of such events. Our project is based on the belief that to fully comprehend the reaction to transition to capitalistic forms of land management, we must look beyond the centerpiece and spectacular to fully engage with the ways this was experienced and resisted. It is important, in other words, that James C. Scott's wonderful formulation of everyday forms of resistance must be brought fully into the analysis. Work in protest studies holds that, as well as being multi-layered and multifaceted, protest is also space. And what we mean here is that the consideration of local environments of protest is essential to full understanding. Such local environments, we suggest, are comprised of the interaction with nature, space, people, culture, society, with the landscape as dynamic and constitutive rather than passive backdrop to human action. To put it more bluntly, protest and resistance emerges from places and particular landscapes. to see local environments of protest and resistance as significant determining factors means thinking beyond and away from the bounded region and beyond the national as well. Our project builds on my doctoral research, which was conducted at the University of Glasgow, and will soon come out as my first book with Edinburgh University Press, hopefully in 2026, but stay tuned. And the book uses the forfeited Annex Estate papers, which the forfeited Annex Estates you can see there on the map, as a case study for the introduction of agrarian improvement in Scotland and the transformation of the landed estate into a capitalist.
Excuse me, Juliette, we can't see the map.
Oh, what can you see?
We're still in the smout. It's cool.
Oh, okay.
It might be worth just stop sharing and then reshare, Juliette. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh no, oh dear, no. I think it's my laptop. It's been playing up, but never mind. Right. Okay. Can you see it now?
That's perfect.
Okay, apologies. It's not fun if there's no tech difficulties during a talk. Right, where was I? So these are the Annex Estates, and now you can see them on the map. And the book really is about the transformation of the landed estates into a capitalist and commercial vehicle for so-called social and economic progress. The estates, to the number of 13 in total, were confiscated and then permanently annexed by the Hanoverian crown between 1752 and 1784. And these estates really offered the opportunity to the British crown to use the Highlands and the islands a little bit, because they did things in Lewis, as an extensive laboratory to experiment with processes of land improvement, such as the introduction of the first comprehensive system of crofting tenure. And one of the ambitions of this research and the book was to replace the Highland tenants at the center of processes of land change by investigation, their interaction with new agrarian practices, as well as the various paths taken to oppose what was perceived as oppressive practices. And what struck me was that in the archives, I uncovered a huge amount of protests directed against enclosure, the introduction of commercial farm arrangements, and the erosion of customary practices. Protests also ranged much beyond the land raids of the 1880s, from the writing of subversive petitions, the hiring of lawyers to challenge clearances in courts, the destruction of symbols of improvement such as dikes and hedges, and even physical retaliation against sheep farmers and manufacturers. And two broad conclusions followed. First, that the Highland rural world was far more dynamic, pragmatic, but also adaptable. That has been given credit for until now. And that the Scottish landed elite, regarded as the absolute masters of both beast and man, had far less power over people and the land than recognized until now. The second conclusion drawn was that protest actions took different forms, but motivations remained remarkably similar and around all of the Annex Estates. In fact, the two areas where I found the most protest were Coigich in the estate of Cromarty, so that's, you can see at the top of the map there, north of Leverhulme, and the estate of Perth, in particular the village of Callander. Significantly, these areas had very different systems of land holding, and while in Coigich inhabitants spoke little to no English in 1755, Gaelic-speaking parishes in Perthshire had already experienced extensive waves of Anglicization earlier in the century. This suggested to me that the very concept of Highland protest I've already spoken about, typified by opposition to clearances in the Gaelic-speaking Northwest, and in turn insistence on language and culture as the only basis of all protest and resistance, had led to these essentialist claims, fueling, perhaps a little bit unwillingly, a narrative of Highland exceptionalism. And if anything, these findings encouraged us and cemented the need to dig further in the 18th century archives across different parts of the Highlands and Islands. Hopefully you can see my next slide, but shout if you can't. This brings us to Resistance to Improvement, a 3-year project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which returns to a period following Culloden and examines then more closely how those who worked land and sea in the Highlands and Islands not only experience improvements, but also attempted to influence its aims and consequences. The project's overarching aim, in addition to uncovering the range and amount of rural resistance between those two dates, 1750 and 1820, is to test what I've spoken about as Highland protest paradigm. The idea that protest, when it did occur, was the preserve of the Northwest and took, more importantly, very recognizable forms typified by collective, reactionary, and short-lived responses to improvement. Our project, I've mentioned, is the outcome of a collaboration with Iain Robertson and Carl Griffin. You can see both of them. That's us looking very happy on the opening day of project in Ullapool. Iain, who's an associate professor at the Centre for History, has written extensively on the historical geography of protests in this region, with a particular focus on the 20th century. And Carl, who's a professor of historical geography at the University of Sussex, his research ranges on from the Reformation to the mid-19th century, primarily in the context of rural England. His work, amongst other things, has reset really how we think about rural protest, from large-scale quasi-insurrection like the swing riots to the politics of rural anger, to introducing as well the study of more than human environmental protest. So our project focuses on 5 core regional case studies: Argyll, Strathspey, Isle of Lewis, Caithness, and Perthshire. These areas were picked for geographical and cultural reasons, as both Strathspey and Perthshire straddle the island line. In addition, we've been happy to let the archives guide us. So when finding something good, just following our instinct. And for that reason, we've already, after a year, we've collected additional case studies in both Northart and Inverness-shire. So really the aim is to have as complete a picture as we can. Taken together, these case studies, we hope, will offer the first systematic regional comparison of the resort to protest in this period by tapping into the incredibly rich archives of the 18th century and early 19th century. Starting, of course, with estate papers. So we've picked roughly 1 or 2 collections per case study. So, for example, the Grant of Grants, GD 248, if you know it, in the National Records, or private collections such as the Argyll papers kept at Inverary Castle. You can see a picture of the view at Inverary Castle, so it's really worth the trip. We're also systematically and extensively sampling portions of sheriff and barony courts, as well as justices of the peace and high court records. This really involves then looking at an incredible area of sources, ranging from leases, tenant petitions, barrack records, and more. And although very few sources have survived in Gaelic for this period, although I've put on the slide a source entirely in Gaelic, a letter talking about woodcutting, which is quite amazing. We are also tapping into Gaelic poetry wherever we can and trying to use the archive creatively to fill this cultural and social gaps. Even though we are only about 14 months into this 3-year project, we can already report very exciting insights, which speak both to the current historiographical understanding of this period, but also protest studies more generally. And before we bring the main part of the papers to a close with a set of detailed, physically focused example on the Isle of Lewis and Argyll, we turn to a broad overview of the main areas and manifestations of tensions, conflict, and resistance that have emerged from our archival delving thus far. So in general terms, what has emerged most strongly is a sheer range of mechanisms used by tenants to challenge their domination. Inevitably, these embrace well-known responses, such as opposition to military recruitment, smuggling, illegal distilling, of which there is a lot. I've put a picture there on the slide. But there were means to challenge and to protest that are also absent from this historiography, as in the case tensions around enclosure were way more nuanced that has been acknowledged hitherto. But not even acknowledged are the opportunities for small tenants and subtenants to negotiate with their landlords, just one of the weapons to challenge authorities. Here then is just one small part of an untold broader strategy of turning the estate against itself, using the levers of improvements against the improvers, which I will say more about shortly. Delving into legal records as well, such as the papers of Archibald Bell, you can see on the slide, who was a writer, as in the Scottish sense here, so a lawyer based in Inveraray. It also became very clear that the poor did have lawyers and that they hired these writers, like Archibald Bell, to challenge removals in court. We are therefore starting to think of as legal cultures of resistance, an area very rarely discussed as part of the conflict repertoire, or to put it another way, the tool in the protesters' toolbox included legal and, as we see, extra legal means. When grievances were pursued through the courts, arguments were often based on custom and of tenurial rights. There is no doubting, in other words, that all the levels of the estate ladder tenants knew the law. Crucially, such tactics require cooperation, foresight, and planning, the antithesis of what dominant paradigms have established as Highland protest. Thus, there is a strong evidence of what might be called tenurial agency, the reorganization of tendencies from below, as means to resist the imposition of change from above. But if that failed, then tenants readily turned to other tactics, such as sowing their lands in the face of summons to quit. Fascinatingly, this turn to the non-human is also a common practice found with the Highlands, a linkage which speaks to one of the key aspirations of this project and the questions of supposedly exclusively Highland protest form or forms. The enrollment of the non-human in the protest performance is, we suggest, absolutely not a Highland phenomenon. Here perhaps are those everyday form of peasant resistance that James C. Scott calls the weapons of the weak. This hugely influential way of thinking opens a world of negotiation and resistance previously closed to the Highland historiography. But we suggest those resistings were nearly solely the peasantry, nor they were exclusively weak, even if at times, as in Morven in 1720s and again in 1740s, people may have turned to animal maiming. This was not the weapon of first resort. A further connection with protest performances from other times and places, indeed another indication of the central role of the non-human in these forms of resistance, is that many of the conflicts that we have uncovered center on tensions over natural resources and access to spaces where these were located, such as mosses, woodlands, and muirs. Decrees against woodcutting, such as the one on the slide, are almost ubiquitous in both court and estate archives. There's a link here, of course, to the wider notion of social crime. While this can be somewhat tricky to navigate what is protest and what is simply theft, there are clear connections between this way of thinking and the ubiquitous nature of both poaching and wood stealing, along the many occurrences of both encroachment and trespass, often in the face of very aggressive prosecution. These were activities that endured across decades. And this is both rarely recorded in the wider protest studies literature and suggests a strong link to custom, which rather challenges the prevailing view that it had no role in protest, unlike in England, and that in Scotland, custom was entirely divorced from law. What emerges then from this macro level reading of our evidence are contributions to two parallel but only rarely dialogical sets of literature, the fields of protest studies and Highland and Island history. To deepen a sense of the possibilities on offer, here we now turn to the final substantive section and to detailed case study. To begin, we turn to the central questions of negotiations with one's landlord, a central feature of their archival evidence, but so rarely talked about. The relationship between landlords and tenants is often characterized in terms of repression. What is arguably more interesting and appropriate, perhaps, is to think of negotiation. We speak here specifically of the question of the tenurial economy and how tenants came to negotiate their social position in times of change. Before I turn to a specific example in Argyll, it's important to contextualize the introduction of leases in particular, meaning here a lease, a rental agreement between a landlord and a tenant, to explain why, when casting an imaginative eye at the archive, these leases shift from the ultimate expression of proprietorial control to a tool of negotiation and even at times subversion turned against the estate and improvement. The introduction of leases on most Scottish estates really begins in the mid-18th century, written leases, I should say. And this was, in a sense, the key to agrarian transformation. And in Scotland, and in particular in the Highlands before 1750, very few rural dwellers had leases. Most of them were tenants at will. That meant that they occupied the land at the discretion of the landowner, who could then order them to leave after a very summary legal proceeding. By contrast, the introduction of long leases, so a long lease ranging from 20 to 40 years, really depending on the location, changed the game, so to speak. Leases then became tied to new obligations, such as fencing off one's plot or planting certain crops, vegetables to increase yields. Most of these leases were often referred to as improving leases. The incentive then, designed to both motivate and compel the tenant's farmer to adopt these so-called modern or improved agricultural practices, was a degree of security of tenure through the right of possession, never ownership, of course, of one's farm or plot and later on croft. And this was guaranteed often for the first time in writing. So why am I telling you all this about leases? Because historians have very often viewed these leases as a major advantage for landowners who gained an additional means of control over the tenants to compel them to adopt agrarian reforms. However, conversely, the adoption of introduction of leases opened up new opportunities by offering those in precarious situation the chance to obtain assurances and guarantees from their new owners. This matters because Highland resistance as a paradigm is too often portrayed as reactive to changes imposed from above rather than molding landscape change from below. The second very interconnected theme I'd like to focus on today is that of immigration, as the threat of depopulation offered leaseless tenants in particular, but also taxmen who had large farms under their control, a card to play to secure socioeconomic position and, again, security of tenure. Up to the early 1800s, landlords were, as a whole, opposed to clearance and needed a large workforce. Of course, as we know, that changes very quickly, especially after the 1810s. Populationist beliefs and landowners' preference for labor-intensive pursuits meant that ideas about growth and profit were enshrined in the ethos of the estate economy. Across many areas of the Highlands and Islands, the need for labor in farms and in emerging industries, chiefly linen, meant that immigration presented a real threat to profit, and conversely, then, for tenants, an opportunity to both contest a rapid commercialization and for those who stayed to negotiate for their landlord. One of such negotiations centered on what we'll call tenurial bargaining, or seeking opportunities to secure right of possession of the land in times of growing economic insecurity. Our first case study then today is Argyll, a region that offers perhaps unparalleled richness in terms of archival evidence, both in Inverary Castle and the National Library of Scotland. There, the introduction of leases and more broadly, the reorganization of tenurial patterns went through different phases. Whereas the period of improvement is generally portrayed as a brutal but uncontested transition between collective forms of farming to increasingly capitalistic forms of land management, Argyll offers an interesting example of the stop and start nature of many policies of improvements pursued by landed estates. Their attempts to improve started quite early in the 1690s, really, with the influx of Campbell and other lowland settlers. And by the 1720s, 1730s, lease reorganization was fully on the way. However, as early as these early phases of improvement were immediately met with immigration, forcing the Duke of Argyll, in fact, to lower back the rents and rely on traditional tacksmen, so that these are large farmers that he had hoped to get rid of to maintain population levels. What happened, in fact, was almost a reversal of policy, displaying the negotiation skills of the tenantry. Using the context of mass immigration to their advantage, subtenants and feuars refused to improve unless tax, here meaning leases, were given them, an instance of using improvement against itself. And this continues well into the 1750s. The creation of the improved landscape in Inverary, and I've put a little map of a park created in Inverary grounds. So this starts really fully underway in the 1750s, is also contested, and where the Duke's numerous privatized cattle parks and other enclosures are constantly trespassed and encroached upon, as well as nearly constant, you can see in the archive, illegal woodcutting. And I bring this up to highlight the parallel coexisting natures of different forms of resistance, both using legal and extra-legal means to assert oneself and one's rights. By the 1770s, a decade of emigration and famine, we find Kintyre in particular agitated. Tenants there were threatening to leave if they did not get leases, and some refused the increased rent. For instance, the scheme of augmentation of farms opened for a lease, which was introduced in Whitsunday 1775, was met with total opposition, as tenants refused to take up the tack due to higher rents, which forced for the Duke to lower back the rents, with another acknowledgement that farmer markets and immigration have forced them to return to the negotiating table. But the largest reaction in Argyll was directed at the introduction of farmers from Northumberland, more settlers. All these settlers were offered long leases, a tax of 19 years based on improvement regulation. And their influx enables the Duke to increase the rents again, roughly double them, really. So this is 1775. But what is even more interesting, looking at articles of roup, so that means conditions of lease by auction, so auction being a very common way to let farms in this period, was the way native tenant farmers started overbidding at these auctions for the possession as a way to keep the English settlers out. So at first glance, this looks maybe like a tactic driven by desperation to avoid losing access to land altogether. But we believe that this was due to concerted and organized effort. It was said that a scheme concerted among them and a knot of farmers, assuming tacksmen, in their neighborhood to adhere to their refusal of giving up the lease in order to exclude English men from having a footing or possession in this neighborhood. This is not a unique example. In Strathspey, which is another one of our case studies, in 1767, a similar practice happened, as we were told that, quote, the natives here do not like that strangers should come among them, and in order to get rid of such will offer more than what the place can bear. So exactly the same thing. It was very strongly suggested in Strathspey that the gentry actually operated as a sort of anti-rent raising force as well. So I think that there's enough evidence to speak of a anti-clearance tactic, anti-removal tactic, and definitely a refusal to abandon land in the hands of external settlers, as well as an organized, here we can see they're meeting, there's a scheme concerted, an organized method to challenge landholding restructuration, working alongside other tools such as negotiation of leases and immigration. Moving to the island portion of this talk then. Very similar tactics appeared in the Isle of Lewis at the very same period, confirming that this was not an isolated case. Lewis is a place particularly close to my heart because I live there, but also because the island illustrates the tendency in the historiography to gloss over certain events of the 18th century and present then later events in a historical vacuum. Because Lewis, as many of you will know, I'm sure, is very associated with protest, as he was the scene of perhaps the most famous land raids of the 19th and then even 20th century, which have been commemorated in incredible monuments across the island. By contrast, however, very little research has been done on protest in Lewis in the 18th century, or even actually you could say the history of the island in the 18th century. And yet it was a time of extreme change, starting with gradual rearrangement of the estates, starting really the 1750s to the first mass evictions of the 1790s to create the estate's first large-scale sheep farms. In the 1760s, new regulations were introduced in the island, such as holdings on improvable land, usually mossy or peaty grounds. Surveys are ordered, crofting first makes an appearance, rents start increasing very dramatically, and manufacturers are first introduced. All of these changes are not met quietly. The first spinning school created in 1763, so this is a spinning school for linen, not yet wool. This generates a huge amount of sustained opposition for both men and women who are sent there to work against their will. Despite threats of removal, the women in particular managed to significantly thwart production for over 10 years. And they're doing this by employing methods such as food dragging, theft, and non-attendance. By the 1770s, with bad harvest and immigration across the islands, not just Lewis is again under a sustained period of protest. So squeezed by higher rents and deteriorating living conditions, famine looming due to poor harvest, many tenants in Lewis choose to immigrate in this period. It is important to remember, once again, that landlords see population growth as the key source of wealth and human capital as absolutely essential to fuel the improvement and the commercialization of their estate. So tenants' decisions to immigrate is done first is done against the express wishes of the landowner, but it's also done to spite the landowner. And in defiance of their orders. So in 1774, just to give you an example of the spread and scale of immigration, in 1774, the Lewis Presbytery spoke of an epidemical frenzy, which has seized people from migrating to North America. The Annual Register reports that on 22nd June 1773, between 700 and 800 people left Stornoway, an astonishing number, such as because the island population was on that year roughly 7,000. So we're speaking perhaps as much as 10% of the total population. In order to prevent and stop immigration, estate management resort to different strategies, threatening shipmasters with legal action, for example, such as Thomas Iain, master of the Friendship of Philadelphia, who in 1774 was accused of illegally decoying, enlisting, and indenting tenants and draining the country of, quote, useful inhabitants. This does very little. A further issue arises when when immigrants start to leave without paying their arrears of rent. This leaves a huge hole in estate coffers and creates a significant cash flow issue for the estate. In response, estate management attempt to force the tenants to pay their arrears before leaving, which of course they don't do. And threats of removal can do very little at this point. Correspondence with Seaforth, so the landowner's legal agent, shows a sort of brainstorming which takes place by suggesting to point, meaning to seize, some of the tenant's property, such as cattle, which could then be sold. As the Seaforth's legal agent wrote to the factor in 1772, quote, "This is the only method which occurs to me in the present situation." And it does happen to tenants in Bor, for example, that same year, who found their barley crop had been seized to prevent them from distilling, one of the main ways to generate cash. And it is difficult then not to see in these acts of immigration a form of opposition, if not protest, to unrestrained commercialism and deteriorating economic conditions. What we're perhaps even more interested in, however, is what happens to those who decide to stay behind. Their immigration also creates opportunities for subversion. One thing that appears during my PhD in the annexed states evidence, and I'm starting to see elsewhere, are the efforts by tenants lower down the social ladder, such as subtenants, to access privileges and or better living conditions in this pre-mass clearance period. Inhabitants of Stornoway in 1773 decide to negotiate the terms of their charters, asking boldly to be permitted, quote, to point against the seas their taxman's cattle on the same terms as theirs as pointed for encroaching. We should stress here that this is bold language, showing an increased desire to access economic and indeed social independence and agency. In the memorial that same year, the factor reported that the Stornoway tenants were in fact refusing to accept their charters altogether, negotiating the amount of taxes they were to pay upon entry. That same year, 1773, being the peak year of emigration, the men of Nevis Barvis on the west coast intimidates one of the estate officials by announcing in a big group that they would, quote, never take the land as formerly, and wishing he would write the estate factor to inform him of such. Immigration could also be used to bargain for better living conditions. In a petition, a tenant in Galson advanced that he had prevented his sons to go to America, and that therefore he should get better land elsewhere. Again, this is not only happening in Lewis, we've seen similar things in Argyll. And one can sense in the correspondence that the spirit of emigration is spreading and scaring landlords and estate factors. In Lewis, positive news from emigrants from Skye was said to fuel the fire, while tenants in O'Kelsh in Rossshire had apparently done, quote, a great and early bristle about their tax, although the writer was not content that they were, quote, humble as the rest. What is clear, however, is that change was not happening against a passive and quiet backdrop. We are still early in our project, but a few conclusions can already be drawn. First, we hope that in the very short amount of time we've had today to have showcased that the local and perhaps even macro geography of protest matters. Resistance to improvements, as noted, is driven through 5 sub-regional case studies, but we're also addressing spatial scales other than the sub-regional. This project rests on the belief that the landed estates, the inescapable frame of study for 18th century Highlands, as well as other scales and spaces from the parish to township to even the estate mosses, help reveal the complex and often conflictual set of interactions between landlord and tenantry. And seeking to add levels of nuance and specialized thinking to understanding this crucial period, we echo what protest studies now see as the fluid, boundary-breaking, multi-layered nature of protest, their situated messiness. Second conclusion, resistance was varied and sophisticated. We've chosen today specifically to focus on patterns of tenure negotiation and immigration, perhaps less exciting than land raids, but this is to show the diversity of responses to agrarian improvement, far from the more expected focus on collective reaction to evictions, as a way really to stress the complex array of protest response forms and across the social ladder. So what's next? The next few months, we will continue to delve deeper in archival records, turning the NRS into our second home. We also have a few publications on the way, including a paper which explores rural terror on the Glenshiel estate in the early 19th century in what was once part of the vast Seaforth properties. We have been sharing some of these early findings alongside new and exciting research conducted by other scholars on our website blog, which you can find on the web address on the slide. And we would love it if as many of you as possible engage with our project to continue to unearth more evidence for and of tenurial agency. Thank you very much.